Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Sunday session on the 1st of June. We have the usual suspect, Kevin Elmy from Alberta, and we are waiting for Paul, but we're not sure if there's a fire close to him, so we're not sure if he's actually not going to turn up, but that's all okay because we've got the Terry McCosker in the right-hand corner. And welcome, everybody. Welcome to the live if you're watching. And for those of you that don't know who Terry is, I'm just going to let him explain what he's been doing for the last 40 or 50 years because he is a big name in the regenerative circles here in Australia. So over to you, Terry.
Thank you, Tamzin. I've been in the regen space for probably 40 years now, and had a fair influence on that in Australia. Started from the grazing and then worked up to soils and a range of other things, and now heavily involved in soil carbon, measuring soil carbon.
Oh, wow. Okay. Thank you. That was a quick intro.
There's probably a fair bit more around on the internet or places you can find if you're interested.
So what happened was last time we were on the live, Kevin and Paul and I, once we'd finished with the live, we were discussing about the perception of language and how people, particularly in Canada, maybe North America, are misinterpreting timed rotational grazing or set stocking. And so I thought the first person that came into my mind was Terry, because he's had so many years of experience and he really knows his stuff and he can put it into context. And so I thought, well, this session can all be about, my little language bit here is perception and perspective. Now then, your perception of something is really linked to your cognitive bias, lack of seeing the whole, and your misinterpretation of the actual truth that is underlying whatever it is that you're looking at. And perspective is when you are sort of playing devil's advocate and you're looking at the story or the terminology from both sides, and you have to really put it into perspective as to what is the underlying truth, whether you like it or not. That's the whole point of being the devil's advocate. There's some things that you just don't like to be listening to, but it's the only time when you really see the truth. And what I have heard as well, and I sort of was able to relate this to just having arguments with people as well, is that if you are always living in perception, if everything that you say and believe in is perceived a specific way, then you will always lose because you're not seeing the whole truth. And this is really good when you're putting the principles in context as well. And there was an article that sort of triggered all this for me. And it was titled, "The New Report Identifies Toxic Impact of No-Till Agriculture, Inaccurately Referred to as Regenerative." And so immediately the words that I chose was no-till and regenerative. And if you remember one of the lives early on when I was discussing about going through the sections, and then at the end you have the cult, and the cult is about being rigid in your thought process and actually just saying that no-till is regenerative, when in actual fact one of the principles, and we'll go back to the principles, is to minimize soil disturbance. And that doesn't mean cut out ploughing altogether or tilling. It just means that in your context, when you're looking at your situation, if you have a hard pan, there may be there's a reason that you do need to deep rip or to plough or to disturb that soil in a way and plant your multi-species straight in so that you can maximize the optimum potential of that soil at that particular time. So if you haven't read that article, I would, because it's quite eye-opening, and it's a great way of actually understanding and interpreting language and how misinterpretation of regenerative practices is being looked at in a way that may be detrimental to us moving forwards. So would any of you like to, because you've both read the report, would you like to comment on anything or any aspect of the language side of things?
Well, I certainly would. I think that I look at tillage actually as a tool, not a principle. And I think that it's a matter of choosing the right tool for the right job. I think that I'll give you my definition of regenerative agriculture, because it's not about inputs. It's not about how you do things. And I think whenever we talk about practices and how you achieve things, we're going to end up tied up in knots. Regenerative agriculture for me is about outcomes. It's about changing soil health, which changes plant health, which changes animal health, which changes human health, all of which changes business, and all of which changes community. And so to me, regenerative agriculture is everything that encompasses from, but they're all outcomes. So improving soil health is an outcome of different practices. And I think in cropping systems, you will need to be doing zero till or minimum till most of the time. But there are some times when you need to come in with a heavier tool. And so I'm very pragmatic about the tools that people use and how we go about creating that change in our ecosystem, in our own health, and in our communities. And I say communities because, I've been in this space a long time, and what I've found working with people is that when they start to make more money, the first thing they do is employ somebody else. And if you had more and more farmers employing more people instead of employing less people, that will rebuild communities. And we'll have more kids in schools. We'll have more people there for the hospitals and so on, and more skills back in our community. So to me, regenerative agriculture is much, much bigger. And I don't get tied up in how we do it. And I think whenever we do that, and there are people trying to establish certification schemes for regenerative agriculture. And I think it's absolutely the wrong way to go. I think what we need is a verification. So you verify that your soils have improved, or verify that the nutrient density of the food that you've produced has increased. Then you could only be regenerative to have achieved those things. So that's roughly my view.
Yeah,
I like it. I like it.
So there's definitely the difference between the principles and the practices. And one thing that drew my attention to Kevin was that when you're that successful with your multi-species and you're getting the mycorrhizal fungi, for example, to really kick off and get established, there are points where if you're trying to grow, for example, brassica as your crop, you then have to disturb the soil so that you make it a little bit more, you get that ratio back into the bacterial side of things. Kevin, do you just want to elaborate on that, please?
Yeah, so the thing that I always watch, and once again, Dr. McCosker, this is kind of what he's working with too, is this whole idea of soil succession, plant succession. The soils have to be in a certain state in order to trigger successful growing some of these crops that we're growing, and where are we in that plant succession, soil succession. And once we start getting this active fungi in the soil, we have that soil structure and we have those regenerative principles in place, and as we get moving down that road, farming becomes easier, it's more profitable. And so this is where we need to be moving things forward. So it's going to go back to the practices that we do, when we do them, how we do them, and with the intent of of improving that soil. And so when you're looking at Western Canada and you look at the amount of canola being grown and the amount of synthetics being used and the uses of fungicides and no animal impact on the soils, it's these producers are getting some really big, as Chris Nichols says, we have to get this word out of agriculture, yields. We're not talking profitability. And so this is part of what we went as we're going through. I know on our farm, it was the last 8 or 9 years we did not grow any canola. We used a little bit of brassicas and turnips in our multi-species covers. That was my brassica in rotation, and I was seeing drastic improvements in our soil structure, in our soil health, and animal health too.
So what was your cash crop in that instance, Kevin? Were you growing those multi-species as a cash crop?
That was part of it. We were using it somewhat for a hay crop. We were using it for a grazing source. So we started out with some cattle. We brought in some bison that were custom grazing, but we're rotating some soybeans through rotation, some spring triticale, winter triticale. So, and that's at the end. Basically, when you go through the list of crops that we've trialed on the farm, it was any from linseed, flax. We were growing canola, winter wheats, oats. I'm blanking on. I'm under pressure, so. But we were growing lots of different species, and it was evaluating how that was going to be getting into our system. And because we're a pedigreed seed grower, the Canadian Seed Growers Association and Agriculture Canada, they really didn't have much of a sense of humor when it came to the multi-species cropping. So what we were doing is anytime we were growing a cash crop, we always had something growing underneath it that wasn't going to interfere with harvest. It wasn't going to cause contamination, so that and once again, talking to the inspectors, making sure that they were on board, understanding what we're doing. So they didn't write us up, and we had a whole bunch of weeds in our crop that was going to cause our crop to be declined inspection.
So you were primarily a seed grower then, and so were you using your cattle as the fertilizer and as a tool, or were you actually gaining money from them as well?
And it's all custom grazing. For me, I spent basically my whole winter. So when snow's on the ground, traveling Western Canada, talking about soil health and cover crops and how to integrate them. And so during our winter is when we had the livestock on our land. I don't know very much about livestock when it comes to day-to-day management. I understand their feed requirements, and so we were stockpile grazing it through our winter. So we were working with one of our neighbors. That was their animals. They understand the managing of animals, so I worked in conjunction with them, and it was a win-win for us. And then that next year, it would go back into cash crop, and so I had all the manure and urine on the soil, and so it got some fertilizer for me, nutrients. It got some weed control. It allowed me to do these multi-species mixes, and I got some cash at the end of it to make the whole system go around.
Yeah, fantastic. So you used your neighbor's cattle then as your input?
It found a win-win situation, and as long as it's a win-win, they're happy to come back. I even had one of our neighbors. They grazed off the cover crops in the winter, and we agreed to a price. I was happy with it. He was happy with it. He brought the animals home. He saw the weight gains and the condition on them, and he came back and gave me another check. He said that was worth more than what I paid you. So, wow. And then during the growing season, we have grazing groups that are coming by, and it's funny when you see 20 ranchers with their cowboy boots and cowboy hats walking across the field, and they're doing this, going as they're walking. They said, "Your ground is so spongy. It's not rock hard." And I said, "Thank you."
So Terry, for you, it's been more with your multi-species, it's been more about the grazing and the grassland, or has it changed in the 40 years that you've been doing it to people planting sunflowers and millet and things like that?
Well, the multi-species is relatively new in my career. I've been at a lot of this now for nearly 60 years, and regen for only 40 years, but multi-species is relatively new. But I think in terms of regen ag, I consider it a journey, and I think a lot of farmers and landscapes are coming from a very degraded situation, and you've got to earn the right to start making some changes in that. And multi-species is one of the tools that can help you earn that right faster. So is adding soil biology to the seed when you're planting that multi-species. So I think that I use the analogy, and a lot of people are afraid to go from conventional into regenerative, and they perceive there's this valley of death that the business is going to go broke. And I say, well, you know, it's very scary if you think you're going to get on a tightrope and walk across that valley of death on a tightrope. That's scary. But if you actually wanted to not be afraid of going over that, you would have to build a bridge. But before you could build the bridge, you've got to build the foundations. And the foundations is where you earn the right to build the bridge. And so I think depending on you know, what you're actually doing, and you've got to make changes in a cropping game, I think, quite with a lot of consideration, because you've got a lot at risk. And so you start relatively small and do things that are not going to threaten what you're doing, but they're going to start helping build the foundations of your soil health, so that eventually you can go further and further on the journey, if you like, towards regenerative. And I'm not sure that there's an end point in regenerative agriculture. I certainly don't know of one. So I think we've got to be considering it as a journey, not as a destination.
Yeah, absolutely. And so because you're talking about, you know, people starting from ground zero, and their ground zero is whatever it is. So whatever has happened in the past is where they start from. So they could have bought a farm that was starting on the journey of regenerative farming. And how do they make that start then? How can they start building the foundations? Because I've seen absolute bare ground, and I went to a talk with Alejandro Carrillo last week, and it was bare desert, and he says you've got to start grazing. And I was thinking, what are they going to start grazing on when you've got that? I mean, do you give it a rest, the time to rest to start with? But that's then not going to stimulate anything. This is the bit that I'm always a bit unsure of, the chicken or the egg situation.
Yeah, I'm not a believer in starving animals. I think that if you've got bare ground, then the thing to do is not have have no animals on it, and wait until you get some rain and get something on it. And when you get something on it, bring animals onto it, but bring them onto it lightly and for a very short period of time, so that you leave ground cover, that you leave behind some manure and urine. But in those low rainfall areas, you'll never have enough density to be able to distribute dung and urine evenly across paddocks. But it's by at least moving animals around a little bit, you will distribute it. And that might even be just on the other side of a water point. But I think it starts with, in that situation, it actually starts with rest, not animals. And otherwise you're starving the animals. And I think that, you know, there's people that use animals as tools, and there are times when you should do that. You know, Kevin just gave a good example of using the animals as a tool, but the animals in that case are not starved. They're actually doing very well and doing better than that neighbour next door would have done anyway. And so I think if you've actually got to start with rest and get something on it before you go and put animals on it in that desert type situation.
And so, I mean, when we talk about desert, we can have areas of Australia that may be getting rain, but because there's no infiltration happening, it's the equivalent of a desert situation. So how like, what is the very first thing? Can you plant something and get those roots in with that little bit of rain, even though the infiltration is not good? If I'm just seeing this bare, hard concrete area that has been overgrazed, overstocked, over everything for X amount of years, and just need to just get over that little bit of hump to start with, where you need water in the ground. But how does that happen? And yeah, do you bring inputs like big bales of hay in and actually get some animals trampling and just kickstart the whole thing?
Again, that's not economic on that scale. The thing that is economic on that scale is water ponding. So on the contour, on level banks, using a grader or a delver or anything you like to actually just put a little mound, and it's only got to be 6 inches high to hold the water back. And when that water, when you hold it back on those clay pans, then it will eventually infiltrate and you'll get more production. And next rain, because you've actually had some roots, you'll get more infiltration and you'll get more production. So the thing is actually to hold the water up and let nature do the job for you. Putting inputs, into that sort of country it's never going to work. In other landscapes, there's a lot of trees, so you can graze those trees and put animals through there and have an impact on the soil while you're actually browsing rather than grazing.
Yeah, okay. So it really does start with landscape function at the end of the day or beginning of the day.
Yeah.
It's just trying to store and hold that water on, that moisture.
Yeah, and there's a lot of work being done on that now and very successfully.
Yeah, absolutely.
We call that fill and spill here. So that this way we create these berms, fill up that water, and when the water gets too high, it spills over and it feeds the next one. And so having those series, slowing down that water instead of, the cool thing now is to do landscape modification with moving soil instead of allowing that water to get into the ground.
Yeah.
And so in the areas that we had that were poor, so the land that I purchased, it started out as truly dirt. The guy would grow wheat, bale the straw, then burn the stubble. Then he'd grow barley, bale the straw, burn the stubble, and then black summer flow it for a season. And so doing that for 50 years, that was truly dirt. So there was a few spots, half my land was really sandy. And of course there was some blowout spots where the topsoil, well, who knows how many kilometers away it ended up. But so what I was doing was, because it was a small area, bringing bales in to attract those animals in there to get more urine. So it wasn't talking about, a 15,000 hectare area. This was talking about, a 5 hectare area, so that we can import organic matter, carbon, and get those animals to do a little more animal impact in those tough areas.
And so, moving on to then the terminology. So what did you use then when you were talking about on contour and things, Kevin? What was the language you used?
I don't know. You're going to have to help me out.
You dig. What is it? You dig and then you spill something over a...
Fill and spill.
Fill and spill.
Fill and spill. Yeah. So we fill up that lowland with water. When it gets too much, then it spills over into the next berm, and it really slows down that water, allows that water the most chance to get into our soil.
Yeah.
And that the whole idea of how much rain did you get? Well, I got all of it. Instead of there was 25 mils and it hit the soil and there it is, it's gone.
And so moving on to the language then, Terry, with the grazing and having the set stock and the timed rotational grazing, there's now another concept of adaptive grazing, but I have a feeling that the adaptive grazing as we know it is timed rotational grazing. But I know that with Kevin and Paul, they were saying that their timed rotational grazing is rotational grazing, but keeping them all in a set timed rotation, so that it could be 2 weeks that they're on any paddock, rather than adapting the grazing to suit the climate and the weather conditions and the amount of head that you've got and things like that. So would you just be able to talk us through what we understand it as in Australia, please?
I would like to actually put up a table that I developed about 40 years ago now. When I first started studying grazing management, was the mid-80s. And then I got very, very serious in 1990, 91, 92, 93, etc. And as I got into the literature, I got extremely confused, because there is a great list of names for grazing. And so I was sitting in Harare, actually, in Zimbabwe, on my return to Australia, and I had to draft up my report for a Churchill Fellowship where I was studying grazing management around the world. And I thought, I've got to figure out how to get my head around all of this terminology. So I've done that, and it stood the test of time. I'd like to just put this up if I can. I'll just, oops, that's the wrong one.
I'm hoping it does work from your side of things.
Yeah, let me think. There we go. Window, that might be what I'm chasing. Okay, so I'll try it this way. Is anything sharing there?
Not at the moment. I'm just wondering.
Right, let me try another one.
But I might have to do something my side. Kevin, what will I need to do?
I don't know.
Yeah, it's not allowing me to share. So there's something you need to give me a permission.
Yeah, guests can control all presentations. Try it now. I've just switched a button on.
Nothing happening. Let me try that. No, it's not.
Navigate all presentation slides. Yeah, this is the bit we failed. Unless you want to email it to me and I'll try and stick it up. What happens if I... Now then, has there been any questions? I haven't had that one on. If any of you have got any questions, pop them in the chat. That would be great.
No, it's not sharing.
Are you able to email it to me, because I can put it up?
Yeah, let me just... I'm just sending it to you now. I've just sent that to you.
Okay, thank you.
So 2 weeks from now, that'll be our pre-live trial. Is trying to do it before we get on.
Okay, so well, I'll get you guys to chat about something while I'm doing this.
Should have come through there now.
So in Western Canada, the management that we're the new trend, is that the right word to use, is this amp grazing, and it's using the animals as the tool, but we're managing the grass, and the focus is on the grass. So this way we're trying to allow that plant to get that one bite on it and then move the animals along, so we're not getting those multiple bites to really over select certain species in our grazing mixes.
Yeah, I think that AMP is probably not a bad name, but I think there's actually 5 grazing systems that you can choose from, and there's multiple names under each of those systems. And if we could just get this up, that'd be good. Then we can go through it, because if I can show you the names that are in the literature or used around the world under each of these systems, then it sort of becomes much easier to explain. Yeah. So when I was developing this system of trying to understand the names of grazing, I had to get a perspective. So to come back to your terminology in the beginning, Tamzin, what's the perspective? So I decided that I would work out these grazing systems from the perspective of the plant. So one of the reasons there is so much confusion is that some grazing systems are designed for animals, some are designed for people, some are designed for scientists, some are designed for, or not designed. And so I decided, okay, let's look at these things from the perspective of the plant. So if you come to the first one, and that's what I call continuous grazing. There we go. And if we can even just, that's a bit too small for, that'll do to start with. So continuous grazing, and my definition of continuous grazing is that plants are continuously exposed to animals. There's a couple of terms there: set stocking, continuous grazing. There's maybe others. So that's the sort of one that's very, very common around the world. The next one is rotational resting, and rotational resting was developed, well, continuous grazing actually developed in the 1850s when wire was invented. So we started, we were able to put a fence around a property and throw animals in and just leave them there. And so that became continuous grazing. And in South Africa, by the time we got through to the 1920s, the impact of that was showing up right across the landscape. So they started playing with a thing called rotational resting. And rotational resting is where you've got 1 or 2 more paddocks than you've got herds, 1 or 2 paddocks resting. It's really the same as continuous grazing in terms of the impact on the plants. But there's names for that are spelling, deferred rotation, deferred grazing, the Merrill system, which you'll find in the literature. It's this form of rotational resting. And with rotational resting, it's actually the rest that rotates, not the animals. Then in the 1930s, rotational grazing sort of started to become a little bit common, not terribly common, but it certainly moved into the science community. And it was generally based on 4 paddocks. And the reason that the scientists selected 4 paddocks is they reckoned that no producer would ever be able to, would ever put up more than 4 paddocks for a herd. My definition is that it's 3 to 7 paddocks for a herd on fixed calendar-based moves. And this is the critical bit. From the plant's perspective, they're fixed calendar-based moves. So we've got rotational grazing, high intensity, low frequency grazing, short duration grazing, grazing naturally. They're all what I call rotational grazing systems. They're based on fixed calendar-based moves. Now, there's a problem in that for the plants. By the time we got through to the 1950s, there was a guy in South Africa called John Acox, who was a botanist, and he had crawled all over the plants and pastures around South Africa. And in the 1950s, he made an observation that plants should not be exposed to animals for more than 2 weeks at a time. And it really should be everybody's first take-home message about grazing management, because that has since been proven by research on at least 3 countries and continents. And so what he called that was multi-camp rotational grazing. So in South African terminology, a camp is a paddock. So it's multi-paddock. And he took it up to 13 paddocks. So my definition of multicamp is greater than 7 paddocks. And generally each paddock is severely grazed before you move on to the next one. And it's calendar-based moves. Now there are 2 types of this. There's what I call high utilization grazing. So that's the Acock's howl system. That's the one that John Acock's developed originally. Short duration grazing, non-selective grazing, crash grazing, and mob grazing. The common theme amongst all of those is that you graze a paddock out before you move on. Then there's what's called the high performance grazing, which another term for that is controlled selective grazing. And this is where you actually control the selection of the animals. So we use controlled selective grazing to change succession in pastures. So most people will have seen desirable grasses in particular, or desirable species disappearing and undesirable species increasing in plant communities. It's common all over the world. And it's caused by all the grazing systems above that. Controlled selective grazing is, for example, if I've got, and I'll give you an example of a pasture I went into a few years ago. It was 95% wiregrass, which is an unpalatable grass. And when I crawled around the ground, there was some desirable species that were literally millimeters high. They'd been grazed into the ground. So what I said to the grazier is, right, we're going to use controlled selective grazing here. When you come back into these paddocks again, you're going to spend 1 hour in here and then leave. And that's what he did for a year. And what that did was then encourage those desirable plants to start getting up out of the ground. So they were rested, but they were still stimulated. But we did not stimulate the undesirables. So for controlled selective grazing, you cannot cut, burn, or graze the undesirable plants, because you actually want them to become weak naturally. And by selectively grazing the desirables, you're building the strength in the desirables, and eventually they can outcompete the undesirables. So that's controlled selective grazing. Still a little bit calendar-based, but then there's what I call the time control grazing systems. And again, there is 2 types of time control grazing. There's the grazing systems with a production focus. And these are the ones that are used in high input systems, and particularly in the dairy industry. So you've got block grazing, strip grazing, rational grazing, which was the Voisin. And Voisin was the first guy that actually really got onto the time control grazing system in the 1950s. And then there's high density, short duration grazing. Again, greater than 7 paddocks per herd, generally more than that, generally greater than 15. But in the production focused systems, we're using time control, but generally using a lot of fertilizer, particularly a lot of nitrogen, tend to be monocultures, and you're driving production. Under the holistic of focused ones, again, they're time control, but there's the savoury grazing method, cell grazing, time controlled grazing, management intensive grazing, planned grazing, ultra high density grazing, and multi-paddock adaptive grazing are all different names and slightly different nuances in time control grazing. So what is time control grazing? It is based on the growth rate of the plant. So all rotational grazing systems are based on a calendar. So we're moving the animals once a day, once every 2 weeks, once every 3 months. Doesn't matter what it is. If it's calendar based, it's a rotational grazing system. When we move into time control, we're changing the rest period based on the growth rate of the plant. And that's the critical difference between a time control system and any rotational system. The confusing thing is that even in a time control system, we're rotating animals. So that's where the confusion in the language comes in. We're moving. I tend to talk more about moving animals when we talk about time control systems. But those are the definitions that I've come up with. And all of that is based on the plant's requirements or the impact that a grazing system has on the plant. So I hope that sort of it clarifies rather than confuses terminology
fantastic.
around grazing systems.
Yeah, thank you so much, Terry, because I thought there was 3. But yeah, you can totally see why, unless it's actually explained like that, how people are just getting confused about the terminology. And it's like, yeah, I rotationally graze. And I've got several different paddocks here and I rotationally graze, but I know that I'm not doing it regeneratively because, I now can break it down and see. That's fantastic. So how long did that take you to come up with?
It actually came to me in a few hours sitting in a hotel in Harare, but I had spent 6 or 7 years being confused up to that point, and I had spent 3 months on the road studying cell grazing and looking at grazing management all over the world. So it was something that had actually built and built and built, and then when I put attention on it, the breakthrough was determining that I was going to base that on the plant, not on the animal, and not on the money. So that once I came to that conclusion, then it fell into place. And every time somebody comes up with a new name now, I can just slot it in. So, AMP grazing. And one of the issues with all this naming is that people like to, and particularly the scientific community, so they won't use a term that somebody else is using. So, cell grazing is the term that we've been using for 40 years, but they won't use that because it's associated with savoury. So the scientific community has invented, probably 3/4 of those terms, and then the grazing community then sort of gets totally confused about the terms, and then away we go, and we have great global confusion.
Yeah, exactly. I don't understand why people have to label everything and put it into a box. I'm very much look outside the box, and if it's working for you in your context, then fantastic. Has it got to have a name or specifics? As long as you understand what you're doing, and in your case, like, perfect, focus on the plant and which plants are growing and understand that side, and then the rest will follow. Yeah. Which kind of leads me on to the carbon thing with, I like to express that regenerative farming, the byproduct of regenerative farming, if you're doing it correctly, is carbon, rather than actually focusing on carbon and trying your hardest to get that right.
100% right. So what I say to people that want to do carbon projects is that you first and foremost have to be a regenerative farmer or grazier and do it for the sake of regeneration. And carbon is the outcome and the bonus. If you can get paid for that carbon and carbon credits, that's a bonus for doing the right thing in the first place. But whether you ever get a carbon credit or not, you should be building carbon in your soil. And carbon is not an easy thing to measure, although most people think it is. But it's probably one of the easiest things to measure in terms of understanding that you're moving forward. Because as you're getting carbon, you're getting more soil, you're getting more biodiversity, you're getting all sorts of things, getting more carbon, more water. One of the properties where we've measured carbon change over a 5-year period, he added 32,000 tonnes of organic carbon to his property. At a ratio of 6 tonnes of water per tonne of carbon, that's 200,000 tonnes of water holding capacity that's been added to that property in 5 years. Like 200,000 tonnes of water holding capacity. That's significant.
Yeah.
And if we do that again in the next 5 years, which we're about to remeasure, then he's added 400,000 or 500,000 tonnes. So those properties then are going to be the last into drought and the first out, because they've now got an effective water cycle. And I think that globally, a lot of the climate change stuff we're seeing in agriculture is more a function of a broken water cycle than it is of CO2. Absolutely. And if we just get agriculture working properly and cover these soils, get the soils healthy, get the whole small water cycle working, the variability in our climates, in our bigger continents, will be much, much less than it is today.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm so pleased you just said that. and the thing is that
exactly.
Why focus on the air when we're walking on the ground and we can actually do something to the ground rather than worry about what's going on in the atmosphere?
Well, the thing is that most people don't realise that water vapour is 75% of the greenhouse effect, right? CO2, or it's 70%, I should say, not 75. CO2 is only 25% of the greenhouse effect. So we're focusing on CO2 and making minor changes in the atmosphere to CO2, whereas water vapour is by far and away the greatest influence on climate. Now, climate scientists know that, but they don't think they can do anything about it. So they focus on the next biggest thing, which is CO2. But in agriculture, we can pull water vapour out of the atmosphere at between 4 and 10 tonnes of water for every tonne of organic carbon that we put into soils. So when I look at the potential impact of soil organic carbon on climate change, a tonne of organic carbon is worth 3.6 tonnes of CO2. But when I also take into account the impact of drawing down water, 1 tonne of organic carbon is equivalent to over 20 tonnes of CO2. Right? It's a massive multiplying impact on the environment. So we actually, the solution to a lot of what's going on today, human health-wise, environmental health-wise, climate-wise, is to fix agriculture.
Yeah, absolutely.
And get carbon back into our soils.
And I mean,
and we can only do that through regenerative agriculture.
Yeah, and Kevin and Paul, they're seeing the effects firsthand within their own little area of the planet. You just keep those micro water cycles happening, and the rest just follows, and the profit margin increases. Kevin, have you got anything that you've just gone, oh yeah, I need to add this bit?
This is hopefully my my two girls when they're going through junior high school. Their science teacher, they were talking about climate change because that was on the agenda of the curriculum. And the same story I was telling their science teacher, I said, it isn't the biggest greenhouse gas that we have in our atmosphere is this nasty, complicated molecule with H2O. And as a society, how can we get mad at H2O? Because I need to drink this, so we can't get mad at it. Well, the next victim or the next evil villain that we have to attack is, you go down the list, next one's carbon dioxide. And one of the things that I found very early in my regenerative career is water follows carbon. You put the carbon in the ground, the water will be stored there. You put it up in the air, it dries out, you're not going to hold as much water. It's so simple. And so these are the things that, for me to observe, but to have Dr. McCosker to come out and reaffirm, okay, we're on the right track.
Yeah.
So, and once again, in our world, whether it's North America or it's Australia, what are we always concerned about? Drought. And how do we fix drought? Oh, we have water. We have water. We put the carbon in the right spot. The water follows, and away we go.
That's right. Spot on.
Yeah. So I'd like to then move on to these pictures. And Kevin, just so that Terry, you can see what Paul's doing. having a snooze at the moment. But
So
Kevin, just explain to Terry what your history is with Paul and how things have been created.
So I met Paul about 10 years ago, and he's a dairy in northern Saskatchewan, right? Basically, you go north of him and you hit forest and rock. So he's very fringe agriculture. But so this is a picture of one of his customers. We designed a multi-species a cover that they're going to silage, and this is on very light sandy soil, low organic matter. They had problems doing any production. Then we started getting life back into the soil, and there he is. So this is like Miles laying in the swath, and he's right around 6 feet tall, so what 190 centimeters, a big lad. And by having those green living plants, by having the diversity, the different rooting structure, we can create these synergies in soil, and the neighbors were wondering, instead of having chasing so many hectares to get tons for cattle feed, there's a few tons in those swaths that they have.
So these swaths are there for silage, are they?
Yes, they're going to be salvaging this. So we had very oat based mix, but then we had some Japanese millets going through the functional plant groups. We went in with a fair amount of chicory and plantain in those, once again, to get the forbs. We don't have the plant diversity, we don't have the vegetative plants, we don't have those root exudates in these monocrops to keep feeding the soil. So we feed the soil with root exudates for 30 days, and then for 335 days, we're starving our soils. So this vegetative plant is so crucial for so many different levels of keeping this soil going. And this micro water cycle, listening to Dr. Walt Jenny, having those living roots, having that condensation on the leaves, to give that plant the choice of, okay, do I absorb it, or does it roll off, land on the soil, and hydrate the soil around it. It's great stuff once we get these functioning systems going.
So I'm looking at that, and that cut is pretty short. Are those plants, will they come back, or are they, what's going to happen next? What's the process?
So yes, because this is one of the first years under the regenerative multi-species farming, they are traditional to just scraping the ground, because they have to get every gram of production in there, because they're always chasing feed. After doing this, then they started cutting higher and higher, which then all of your junk for the feed standpoint is in the bottom half of the plant. So that as you start cutting in higher and higher, you give up some tonnage, but you're gaining quality. And so they got to understand that, and they absolutely changed their management. With this, because they shaved it, and this would have been the first part of August when they were cutting, that gives us about 40 days of frost free until we usually get our first frost. And choosing species, we were able to have green plants right up until, well, we had some of the species in here actually over winter and keep growing that next year. So we had that continuous carbon feeding the system. Did you replant before it got to the frost or not? Did you just leave these guys to... we just let it go. So we're cutting early enough so that the plants were able to, well, some of them would be terminated after cutting. The others would tiller out and continue growing. So keep it nice and simple. Once again, in fragile environments, if we have an established plant, that's way easier to keep living than to try reintroducing into something that has no moisture. And this is where the farm is, Terry. I've blown it up a bit. Last time it was too small, wasn't it, to see? So can you just explain?
what all those
So
funny
this
little
is
patterns are.
just on the south side or on the bottom part of the picture. That is Birch Hill, Saskatchewan, the booming metropolis of probably 200 people. Where Paul's dairy is where the blue dot is. And so there's 160 acres where you see a lot of water. And so when I first met Paul, he was seeding 54 acres on a 160 acre piece. And so then we started introducing more taproots, more biennials into his mixes. These low spots, I'm sure there's going to be a picture of his wetland seeding mixes. So some of these wet areas on the map. Oh, okay, so a little bit of radish. Once again, you can see where the hard pan is. So some of these wetland areas, they'd be wet through May and June, then they would dry out and then just weeds. And because there was the weeds, between the wet pushing down and creating that hard pan, not allowing the water infiltration, we got a lot of these taproots. So we were introducing some of the radishes. You can see a nice little cracking of the soil there. We're getting some yellow blossom sweet clover, which is a biennial legume with a really good strong taproot. We got some chicory, there's a little bit of good healthy chicory. But we got some living plants into those areas that traditionally were just growing weeds. We got the taproots to open up that soil. We regained water infiltration. There's just a good healthy turnip.
And particularly the handlebar moustache. I'm quite susceptible to those.
That's one of our friends. You don't have to guess who it is when you're at meetings. So he's one of a kind and awesome guy. But just a little spreader put on behind our on a little quad. So we can run around these sloughs. And what I was suggesting to Paul is to go and spread on the edge of the water. So just drive on the edge and spread half into the water, half onto the dry. And as the water would recede, go out there and you can see where your ruts were. So just move over, spread more seed. And, after 3-4 years of doing that, he regained 100 acres. So 45 hectares of land. Just by changing the water cycle. So on the hills and the mid slope, we had a bunch of taproots in there. So we once again opened the soil, got the water to infiltrate. So it stopped it from just running off the hill into the lowland to create water bodies. In those low, there's another good one to add more diversity. So in those low spots, open it up so allow the water to infiltrate. He phoned me a couple of years ago and he said, got a problem now. Those low spots are now filling up with water. And I asked, okay, so what is the water like? Because when the water just runs off the surface into the low spot, that water will then get really murky. And so that slake test that we showed the video a couple of weeks ago, it had that slime on top of that water. And so that's basically all your carbon washing out of your soil aggregates. And we're losing it from the system. And he said that the water is nice and clean. So what happened is the water is infiltrating from the higher ground, getting filtered through our soils, and then pushing up from the bottom of these low spots and filling up the water bodies that way. So this way we had all opportunity for that water to be used by plants. We were able to use that water for transpiration, which means we have root exudates, we're building soil aggregates. Yes, that we got a functioning system.
So he is absolutely lifting his water table level.
Oh, exactly. So a couple of pictures ago, there's one of the producers over near Leduc, just southeast of Edmonton, Alberta. Dieter, so he's another dairy that's been using a lot of these multi-species, and he said his animal health, his plant health, his nutrient purchasing requirements, everything is going the right direction. So Paul has a moisture probe on his land and the neighbors, and his neighbor's a conventional grain farmer. There it is. And so what they're finding is where the conventional farmer soil moisture levels are versus where he's taking all silage, adding no fertilizer, but getting that living root, which, you know, common sense would say that we have living root, we have everything green, it's going to be using all this water. But Paul was getting between 3 and 5 times the amount of soil moisture than what his neighbor has.
Wow.
Incredible. And it's only, what did Paul say, 100 meters apart? So it isn't like he's missing rain or getting rain. It's just that water infiltration capacity. And as Dr. McCosker said, when you start increasing soil organic matter, and with Paul, he started out at 9% soil organic matter in the top, I think, 30 centimeters. I think it was 6 centimeters. Doesn't matter. Anyways, we increased it by 1% per year for 6 years. So now his soil organic matter tests are coming back at 15%, which I didn't think we'd be able to move it that fast. So I don't know what I think. Oh, this is the year where they end up with about 20 mils of rain with that swather. That last picture, that was about 20 millimeters of rain in the whole growing season.
Okay.
So that'd be a disaster in most places. But they were still getting, 4 to 6 tons of silage per acre with you see all the green underneath where they were cutting, still green plants, everything was functioning.
Yeah, he's not cutting it as low there either, is he?
Exactly.
Do you want me to carry on flicking through these? Terry, you can jump in any stage.
No, this is interesting.
Okay. And I just pulled some of these up because they're all different multi-species. They're all, and I just wondered, if you could talk more about what's actually there. Is that just sort of a grass mix?
So that's a perennial grass mix, and this is where in the past it's been, they've just been haying it, and so he's one of the few in Saskatchewan, even maybe Western Canada, where he kicks out his dry cows and he amp grazes his dry cows, and he did some once again trials. Yeah, he's very very well read in the grazing management part of it. But it was dry, so he decided not to graze a couple pieces in the fall and just let it rest. Well, it turned out where he went out and grazed it lightly and then took the animals off. So just that quick hit and took the animals off was way better than letting that soil rest. The plants didn't get that rejuvenation. This is another dairy guy just northwest of Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. Very dry type of climate, but yet when we have these multi-species in, things work. And
what's
it's
the yellow
absolutely
flower,
amazing.
Kevin?
Sunflowers. There's some sunflowers, and I think there's some sweet clover in there. We use a fair amount of. Oh, that's right in the to the left of his head. That is sow thistle. So it's a weed, but one of the years, Paul, when first getting into it, Paul had a depression that most of his cover crop died, and it came up with a lot of sow thistles and cattail. So it's a water-loving plant. He said, "What do I do?" And I said, "Well, silage it and just bag it separately and just see what the feed test came back." And he was actually just shocked with the feed value of these weeds. And the cows did extremely well on it.
And that's not sugar drip sorghum, is it? Is that a type of grass or?
That would be Japanese millet. I like Japanese millet. The sorghums, I'm always concerned about prussic acid in it. So we use a lot of pearl millet, the Japanese. Here's some collards, some Phacelia, some barley. And once again, just that little sprinkling of these brassicas. Once we get too much brassicas in the mixes, they're a little too much bacterial for me. Even though they look really impressive, the animals, they're not designed. Ruminants aren't really designed to eat a lot of the brassicas in the mixes. They're just too rich, too high. They need that fiber in the system. when you start growing the purple top turnips, they're really impressive when you start seeing the potential size of them. And the thing I'm always concerned about when I see the tubers that are this size, that shows me that you have an excess of free nutrients in your system. And so when we have something that's very rich and we need to tie up those nutrients, absolutely. But when we have them in a mix or too high in a mix, growing with a grass, I'm always concerned about those brassicas stealing, because they're scavengers. They're going to take nutrients away from our other cash crop.
So you don't really want to see them this size then, Kevin, or this size is telling you a story?
It tells me a story. So that this tells me that this land has seen a lot of manure or lots of synthetic fertilizer, and it's gone to excess. I've had one producer from Ontario. They grew some radishes, and they were mad at me because these radishes, they were sticking way out of the ground. So I asked them, how much what did you grow? Well, I grew corn. How did the corn do? Well, about 30 metric tons per acre. Okay, so good. What did you use for fertilizer? Well, 200 pounds of N and 60 pounds of phosphate and da 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 da. I said, okay, so that all jives. I said, any manure? Oh yeah, I forgot to tell you, there's 30,000 gallons of dairy manure on it. And I said, well, that was enough to grow your 30-ton crop. You didn't need to add the fertilizer. So because the radishes were growing down, trying to grow down, but they had so many nutrients, they couldn't grow down far enough and fast enough, so they're pushing out of the ground. Whereas you look at this, so what I do when I'm looking at radishes is I take a look to see where the white starts, because the white tells me that's where they're in the ground. Anything green, there's going to be chlorophyll in it. So that gives me an indication of how fast they're growing down. When you look at the picture of pollen, where it kind of kinks, this is where your compaction layers are. And so it's going to be drilling down, and anytime there's a kink, that means we're well over 200 parts or psi in the soil. So it's looking for cracks. And so we've seen where they'll go sideways and then go down.
And so how do you alleviate that? Do you go in with a plow, or do you just plant a different type of species?
3 choices: good, fast, and cheap.
Right.
So as we go through, going in with tillage and deep ripping, that's good. But what else are you doing? If you just go and rip it, that isn't going to fix it. It'll fix it initially, but we need to go in. We need to put some. So there's another producer I work with. He put down some fish and some humic acid when he did his rips, and he did it in strips where he put the fish and the humic acid. The hard pan was just crumbly. Where he just went and ripped it, it was like cement.
Wow.
So it's okay. You're going to rip. What else are you going to do? So as Dr. McCosker said, it's a good tool. How do you use it? What else are you doing? So if you did a deep rip and you added a cover crop over there to get those roots down, to get those roots through that hard pan, that's a win. If you just go and do a deep rip, it's going to slake back to itself and go back to the way it was. We manage for these problems. So in order to change our outcomes, we have to change what we're doing along the route.
Totally agree.
And then the last one, I know it's a bit blurred, but I wasn't sure what that was.
A nodule. So anytime we're growing any legume, we need to be able to pop those nodules open and to see, are they gray or are they pink? If they're gray, they're not active. If they're nice and pink like that one is, if you kind of use your imagination, nice dark pink, that leg hemoglobin is firing on all cylinders. So it is fixing nitrogen. If you have legumes in the mix and it's not nodulated, do we have a nutrient issue, or do we have so much nitrogen in the soil that legume is going to use all the free nitrogen in the soil before it starts nodulating? Because with the legumes, Dr. McCosker, you can correct me, but is it 1/3 of the plant's energy of a legume is required to keep the nodules fixing nitrogen?
Yeah, no, I don't have that number on the top of my head.
Okay,
Kevin, I'll agree with you.
It's a big number, and so this way, once again, I'm lazy. If I can get something for free, I'm going to take that free stuff. if I need to buy it, okay, I'll go and buy it. If I think it's, and so these legumes are going to be doing that same, cost analysis of, okay, here's free stuff. So why do I have to, keep these nodules up and going and using all this energy and using the phosphate? I got free stuff I can use. And so that's where, with those big turnips, most likely if you had a legume in there, if you went and did some digging, you either would not see any or nodules on them, or they would be gray. They would be active.
So if you were planting the legumes for nitrogen fixing only, if you knew that your soil was high in nitrogen, it would be a waste of money actually buying those seeds.
Depends. Once again, as a tool, if you purchased some land, or you're renting some land that had really high histories of high manure on it, where your nitrogen's high and it's going to be causing a problem in the future, by using a legume, it's going to be a really quick way to drop your nitrogen levels in the soil.
Okay, so it's not just the brassica that does that.
Well, the brassica is going to absorb it and use that to create that big tuber. The legume, it's going to, once again, do the cost analysis saying, okay, do I need to fix nitrogen? Oh, there's a whole pool in the soil. I'm going to use that. And then reevaluate, saying, do I have to start nodulation now? Oh, here's some more nitrogen. I don't need to. So we can have really high nitrogen. We can bring that down and then harvest it and then take it off through animals, through hay, through cash crop, whatever.
Yeah.
So once again, the issue with it is, so in that plant synergy, that legume to fix nitrogen, or the nodules, the rhizobium, it needs a lot of phosphate, and so grasses accumulate phosphate. So when you get the mycorrhizae working with the grass and the legume, the grass will call for nitrogen. The legume and the nodules and the rhizobium, they can say, yes, we can produce extra nitrogen for you, but we need phosphate. Because the grass is accumulating phosphate, it can move the phosphate through the mycorrhizae into the legume, into the nodules. It'll fire up, create more nitrogen, use that in the legume, and shuffle that over into the grass. Beautiful system.
Yeah.
Absolutely beautiful. And this is the reason why the multi-species is so crucial. So when you look at this blend behind me, you'd say, oh, it's pretty heavy on the legumes. And it is relatively high, but you don't see the pearl millet, you don't see the perennial ryegrass, you don't see the other species in there that are actually adding landscape function to this mix.
I find I have seen instances where a season will start off grass dominant and end up legume dominant, or vice versa, so that it's not just in a point in time, it's actually over time. The grasses and the legumes will change based on their nitrogen requirements and how much nitrogen's there.
Absolutely. I was up at Dunedoo, well, it was a year and a half, 2 years ago, and going across the guy's paddock, and he said, so what do you think of the catch of the red clover? And I said, well, it's a little on the thick side. And he said, well, it should be, because 5 years ago, he seeded a full rate of red clover in it. He needed some legume into his grass paddock, and it was a dry year. And he said, oh, okay, it was too dry, must have germinated, died. The next year went in with red clover, seeded at full rate. Another dry year, nothing grew. So he said, the heck with it. It's not working. So the year I was there, they got a little bit of rain. Red clover went, just about every one of them that he seeded over 2 years grew. There was red clover everywhere. So once again, it's an indication of your plant succession, your soil succession, the climate, beautiful system. Absolutely beautiful system.
Mother Nature tends to put there what she needs.
Absolutely, and if you give it the chance in these cultivated paddocks, and this is where we'll use the same blend or a very similar blend on a piece of ground for a couple of years, and the first year the brassicas will do really well. The next year it's the legumes will do really well, and so just looking at it as a summary. But as you go, like I said, through the year, it's all of a sudden, oh, okay, well, let's go back to Paul. picking on Paul. The first year I introduced Japanese millet into his mix. He phoned me up in July and he said, next year, no Japanese millet, waste of time. It just didn't work. I said, okay, no problem. In August, he phones me back and he said, how much more Japanese millet should we put into the mix? Because early in the season, the oats took off and it got nice and high and it didn't look like any Japanese millet was in it. The oats headed out. Then the Japanese millet just kept on chugging. And he said, that's the reason why. And so a little bit of warm season, summer active, a little bit of cool season, that plant diversity is crucial. And it's, as the climate changes, as the time of the year changes, your blends will change. And it's great when we give it the opportunity.
Yeah. Fantastic. Well, is there anything anybody else would like to talk about? I actually have been a bit slack with the chat. No, well, there's no questions off YouTube. Is there anything off Facebook? I don't know whether you're not manning that. That's okay. Well, what a fantastic discussion. Thank you so much, both of you. That went better than I thought. So, yeah, and it's been so good to have you on, Terry. Thank you so much for taking time out for the Sunday session.
No worries. Thank you.
And thank you, Kevin, as always.
Well, thanks for setting it up. And Dr. McCosker, is great listening to you again. And keep up the good work.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Just so you know, Terry, Kevin is here on the Eastern Seaboard on March next year. So we're having 4 conferences.
All right. We'll have to try and catch up, Kevin.
Oh, definitely. I hope so.
Yeah.
Would be good. Okay. Thank you, everybody, for listening. And until next Sunday session.